Good morning, sir. Can I call Mr. Alan Milburn, please?
I'd like to stand up and repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Milburn.
Good morning.
My name is Jason Beer, as you know, and I ask questions on behalf of the inquiry. Please, can you give us your full name?
Alan Milburn.
Many thanks for coming to give evidence today, and also for the detailed witness statement that you have already provided to the inquiry. Can we look at that witness statement, please? There should be a hard copy in front of you. For the transcript, the reference is WITN 0350 0100, and on page 21 there should be a signature.
Yes.
Is that your signature?
It is.
And are the contents of the witness statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are.
Thank you. Can I start with some questions about your background and experience? I think you were elected as MP for Darlington in May 1992, is that right?
It is.
You served as a backbench MP until May 1997, when, as part of the new Labour government, you were appointed Minister of State at the Department of Health.
That is correct.
You served in that role for a year and 8 months, by my calculations, until on the 23rd of December 1998, you were appointed as Chief Secretary to the Treasury.
Yes.
You served in that role for a little over 9 months, until the 11th of October 1999, when you were appointed Secretary of State for Health.
That is correct.
It's that 9-month period that we are principally interested in when you were Chief Secretary to the Treasury. What's the role in general terms of the Chief Secretary to the Treasury?
It's a pretty interesting role in government because you you really have a finger in many pies, largely as a consequence of effectively being responsible for all aspects of public expenditure. And so at any one time you can be dealing with an issue like this, or I think during my time, the war in Kosovo, issues around private finance initiative, modernising government, peacekeeping in Sierra Leone. So there's a wide variety of issues that you're dealing with, departments that you're liaising with, and very often the more informal role, I guess, is that you're trying to solve or help solve what have become knotty cross-governmental problems, of which Horizon would be an example. Final role, I guess, is that at the time I was responsible for PPPs, public-private partnerships, private finance initiative, and also for regulation in the city.
And so far as this inquiry is concerned and the Horizon project, there are two particular aspects of the role, as well as obviously the financial element of your role, where it intersects with your responsibilities. Firstly, that this was, when you started office, still a private finance initiative contract, a PFI contract. And secondly, would you agree that this was a knotty problem involving cross-departmental disagreement?
I think that would be a polite understatement. Yes, it was.
Thank you. Now, one of the first communications that you received concerning Horizon was from the General Secretary of the National Federation of Sub-Postmasters, Colin Baker. Can we look at that, please? It'll come up on the right-hand screen for you.
Yeah.
It's NFSP 50372. Thank you. You'll see at the top of the page there that it's a letter to you. It's from Colin Baker, the General Secretary of the Federation. Although the date is typewritten as the 13th of August 1998, somebody has handwritten 8th of January 1999. That date, the handwritten date would make sense, the typewritten date would not, given that this is a letter congratulating you on becoming Chief Secretary to the Treasury.
Yes.
So would you agree that the second date appears more likely to be the correct one?
I guess so, yes, that must be right. I guess that it must have been a standard letter by the looks of things, maybe sent to my predecessor as well.
I was going to ask you about that. Is it normal to receive these congratulatory letters from, in particular, the unions?
It's normal at the beginning. You do tend to get congratulatory letters at the beginning of your term, less so at the end, in my experience. Yes, and not just from the unions. So whether or not I saw it, I've got absolutely no recollection. It's possible I did, but I don't know.
And just help us to understand. We've received some evidence on this issue already. The general public might think that if a letter is written to you with your name on it, you will see it.
Yes.
Can you explain whether that would be an accurate assumption or not?
That is an inaccurate assumption. So there's a sausage machine in government, and for understandable reasons, really. You know, as a minister, you receive a huge amount of correspondence. There's obviously internal correspondence, which no doubt we'll come to, between ministers, and then there's a lot of external correspondence from either members of the public or organisations like the Federation. And in truth, what happens to a lot of them is that they never come into a ministerial office or to a private office. They go into the machine of government, and there will be a correspondence unit, I guess, somewhere in the Treasury, who would effectively either respond to it directly or alternatively draft a response, which would come up to a ministerial office, and then you would sign it off.
And so if there was a reply to this letter, which was just an acknowledgement and a thank you, that wouldn't come up to you to okay it.
No, it wouldn't.
If there was a reply of more substance, we would expect to see a backing paper, a ministerial submission, saying this is the issue, here's the letter, here's a proposed reply in Annex B.
It could take one of two forms. Either there would be a backing paper and a draft letter. Very often there would only be a draft letter. And then it would be a matter for the minister, in this case myself, to determine whether or not the draft reply was a suitable one. So I could either sign it off or I could alter it and it would go back and it would be retyped or whatever and then come up for signature again. But the fact that there doesn't seem, certainly in my bundle of papers, to be a reply to Mr. Baker suggests that that didn't happen in this case.
To what extent was there a channel of communication between you and the NFSP in the 9-month period?
From recollection, I don't know whether there was. I think probably not.
Does it follow that, to your recollection, the Federation did not raise with you issues about the integrity or reliability of the Horizon system in that 9-month period when you were Chief Secretary?
I have no recollection of them doing so.
Thank you. In your witness statement, maybe if we just look at it, please,
Yep.
At paragraph 22, it will come up on the screen as well. It's page 8. Thank you. Paragraph 22. You say, my primary responsibility as Chief Secretary was overseeing public expenditure, whilst Horizon's technical viability and robustness would have been an issue of concern to the Treasury. The operational responsibility for ensuring that it worked in practice would have rested more directly with DTI and DSS. The sentence that operational responsibility for ensuring it worked in practice would have rested more directly with, and I'm interested in DTI here. Is that right, that the Department of Trade and Industry would have had operational responsibility for ensuring that Horizon worked in practice, as opposed to the Post Office?
I think what I mean there is that the DTI as the sponsoring department...
Sorry, can I stop you mid-answer? The transcript has apparently stopped. We've got a live time transcript, and it appears to have frozen. So I'm told it's of the variety of the 10-minute issue, and therefore I'd ask you to rise and we break whilst the transcribers regain connectivity.
I should have kept a table of whether this was more or less likely to happen when I'm present, Mr. Beale. All right.
So 10 minutes,
10 minutes.
I'm sorry.
Sorry about that, Mr. Milburn.
No problem.
So I'm sorry for that delay.
Can I just ask you,
Yeah.
as a matter of interest, is the transcribing, or if that's the correct description, actually stopped, or is it just the display that stopped?
The former.
The former, that's fine.
So the transcriber who is remote, who's not in this building, loses connection.
Right, fine, I'm with you.
So an internet connection.
Yeah.
And therefore the transcription has to stop. And we see that because the display ceases to work. Mr. Milburn, sorry for that interruption to your evidence. At the time of receiving the letter that we were looking at, so that was early January 99, were you aware of any concerns that were circulating within number 10 Downing Street, that the Horizon system itself was flawed and unreliable?
There were certainly concerns, I think, across government, in number 10 Treasury, DTI, and the then DSS, about the operationalising of the Horizon contract, since it was so late. It was delayed, and obviously ICL were in breach of contract and had been for some considerable time, and there were a number of other structural problems, as you're aware, in terms of the relationships between the parties and so on and so forth. If your question is a much narrower question about the operational performance, so to speak, of the rollout, I think that's a different matter. I don't think, from recollection, operational performance issues, even when there was live testing, which, as is clear from my evidence and I think from other ministers' evidence, was something that government was insisting on for perfectly obvious reasons. The results of live testing, what was actually happening, I don't think were visible.
The inquiry has seen correspondence circulating within number 10 at Christmas time, so Christmas 1998, over the narrower issue, so not the concept of involving the benefits agency through the use of a benefit payment card, but the narrower issue of whether the system itself was flawed, was unreliable. At that time and subsequently, those weren't concerns that were shared with or raised with you.
Not to my recollection.
You refer in your witness statement on a number of occasions to a report that was co-authored by Adrian Montague back in July 1998, and the conclusion, or one of the conclusions of that report, that the system was, as it then stood, technically viable. I have in mind, no need to turn them up, paragraphs 21, 55 and 57 of your statement. Were you given, to your recollection, a copy of the Montague report, as I'm going to call it, when you took up office?
Not to my recollection.
And so this is you, in your statement, reflecting back on what you now see the Montague report to say?
Correct.
And still, even though it is reflecting back, do you understand the Montague report to refer to the feasibility of a system that was yet to be trialled, as opposed to an assessment and a conclusion that the system in operation was robust and had integrity?
Yeah, I think there are two separate issues, aren't there? There was the assessment of Adrian's report, and indeed, as I've read in the documents that have been presented to me, the Isabel Anderson note from October 98, which talked about technical feasibility. I think Adrian talked about technical viability. So broadly the same concept. So I guess that was a theoretical appraisal of whether or not it was possible that the program could be implemented. That was on one side. And I think as the skepticism amongst government and officials, I would guess, but speaking for myself as a minister, as the skepticism about the rollout grew, then I think the reliance on a presumption may well have diminished, and that's why, as you will see from the select committee evidence that I cite in my statement, Alistair Darling, my colleague in particular, given the fact that the DSS had been so scarred by previous IT programs, was heavily insistent upon live testing. So was the thing actually working in practice as distinct from theoretically could it work?
Before the decision was taken in May 1999 to go with option B3, essentially, as it was styled.
Yes.
Were you aware of any independent assessment of the operation of the system as it had then been built?
No.
Any external consultant involvement in an independent assessment of the operation of the system as it was then operating, other than looking back to the slightly different issue that you've mentioned, technical feasibility or viability in July 98?
No.
And do you know why that was, that that type of assessment was not commissioned?
I don't know.
Have you a view on whether it ought to have been?
Yes. So I think it is one of the... Look, my direct recollections of all of this period are limited, as I made clear in my statement, but from a careful reading of the documents that the inquiry has made available to me, one of the clear fault lines, in my view, is that there was no independent, ongoing technical expertise that was able to take a view about whether the so-called live testing was actually throwing up more problems than it was creating solutions. And I think it is one of the potentially important lessons to be learned from this sort of implementation, which is that that sort of ongoing technical independent expertise is something that would be of relevance going forward. Now, I'm speaking blind, so to speak, because it may well be that nowadays that's exactly what happens. I don't know. But I would have thought that that might have been something that would have been helpful, in particular for ministers, to have line of sight of.
To what extent did it feel at the time that you were taking this decision blind to an independent and rigorous assessment of the technical merits or demerits of the system?
I think we were reliant on two things. First of all, the Montague assessment that it was viable, and secondly, the assurance that the system, which ICL I think were uncomfortable with, because I think from what I've read that they were more wanting to see laboratory testing than live testing, that the live testing would demonstrate the workability of the system.
Can you remember whether anyone raised that issue? We're lacking here consultancy input, or and I'm not thinking of sort of city consultancy, KPMG type input, but somebody outside of POCL and ICL giving us a cold, hard assessment of the technology here?
I mean, look, it's quarter of a century ago almost, and so, but I have no recollection of that. No.
Can we look, please, at paragraph 11 of your witness statement, still dealing with January 1999. In paragraph 11, you exhibit a copy of an undated draft letter from Stephen Byers to the Prime Minister. And you say that this document shows, despite the serious problems with the contract, ICL were still expecting new money from the government and to make a financial return in order to make the deal agreed between ICL and POCL in December 98 work. If we can just look at that letter, please. That's Bayes 40167. This is the letter to which you refer. And if you just scan, I'm not going to read them out in full, but if you scan the first part of the letter on page 1,
yeah,
and then go over to page 2, and the first couple of paragraphs on page 2 before we get to the part where ICL is looking for a revenue stream. It's clear there, as well as the issue of ICL asking for new money from government to make a financial return, the balance of the letter also refers to Fujitsu's sense of having been badly treated by the government, as well as the commercial background of ICL having spent significant sums of money in developing the project, in addition to future investment proposals. Would that be fair?
Yes. Fair in terms of the content of the letter.
Yes,
whether
exactly.
It's fair is a different point.
Yes, fair in terms of the content of the letter. I'm just asked to ensure that, in the interest of balance, other parts of the letter are drawn to your attention in public. Did you form a view at the time as to whether or not the substance of what was being said was fair?
I think there were clear structural problems from the outset with this. The government of which I was a member inherited what was a failing contract. And maybe the way it was set up from the outset, it could be argued it was designed almost to fail, given that there were different objectives on the part of the principal sponsors, the benefits agency, DSS on the one side, DTI and the post office on the other. There was huge ambiguity there. However, and of course the Programme Delivery Authority and all of the issues that ICL Fujitsu raise about continual chopping and changing and so on and so forth. It does take two to tango, however, and there was also another pattern through all of this, I think, which is that ICL had signed up to something that they were unable to deliver. And I think when I look at it today, it's pretty clear that the complexity of the contract was dramatically underestimated. The timescales were heroic, and to put it politely, the management and governance structures were deeply ambiguous. But the job of the contractor, particularly in a PFI deal, is to take that responsibility and absorb those risks. That's the point about PFI. It's about the transferal of risk. So all the parties bear some responsibility.
You said in the course of that answer that the governance and management structures were deeply ambiguous. What were you referring to in particular there?
Well, my view about these things is that clarity beats ambiguity every single time, particularly when it comes to something as complex as the delivery of this huge program, 19,000 post offices, 40,000 counters. And yet it was pretty obvious, and all the papers bear this out really, that the DSS and the Benefits Agency had a different objective from the DTI and the Post Office, and those objectives there was an attempt to marry them through the mechanism of the Programme Delivery Authority, but all that really did was bring together different points of view and different interests. So in the end, what I don't see from what I read today is that there was a single point of accountability and responsibility for the delivery of this thing. And that, it seems to me, is one of the big failures and maybe one of the big lessons to be learned.
What ought to have occurred then? What structure ought to have been put in place?
Well, somebody, somewhere, should have had sole responsibility. It should have been their responsibility.
Was that not obvious at the time and didn't need reflection of 20 years in the past?
As I say, the government of which I was a member inherited both a governance structure and a contract. And obviously I don't know, none of us know how that was set up, how the decisions were made, why the structures were designed in the way that they were. But of course, at the time, it's perfectly obvious from reading all of these papers that those concerns were pretty deeply felt. It was one of the reasons, not the sole reason, it was one of the reasons which contributed to the view that we had to leave no stone unturned in order to try to find a way of making this thing either work or not, in terms of either to make it work or to terminate it. And the truth is that, as I look at it today, there were no easy solutions or easy answers here. They were pretty fine judgments. And you were in a position where, quite a lot of bad money had been thrown at this. And the question is whether you threw more good money at it, because we were well into it, or whether you did something more dramatic and terminated the thing with pretty big consequences for the post office and for postmasters in particular, or whether you tried to find a way through it. And I guess the effort over the course of the January to May period, when I was obviously involved with this alongside with Steve and Alistair in particular, and Charlie Faulkner, was we were trying to find a way through this.
Just winding forwards to May, when the decision was made to drop the Benefits Agency out of the tripartite agreement, to stop the use of a PFI contract, to move to a bilateral agreement between POCL and ICL using a standard design or more standard design and build contract for the provision and supply of goods and services. Was the opportunity taken then to address the issue of governance, management and oversight of the project at that stage?
Not to my recollection.
And why was that? Did that not represent an opportunity when very substantial elements of the programme were being reset to address the issue that you have raised?
I don't know why that was.
Can you recall in the period between your appointment and May 1999, whether concerns were raised with you, in particular through the DTI, that the Post Office considered that the PFI contract denied them visibility or sight on the high and low level design of the system that they were being asked to use, that they were being presented with what was described as a black box that just produced outputs that they needed to trust in. Was that something that was that had filtered up to you?
Not that I can remember, no.
And again, the same question, when it came to May 99 and the resetting of the arrangements, can you recall whether that was an issue of discussion? We can now use this opportunity to address that problem.
I can't recollect that conversation taking place, and I suspect that if it had taken place, it was taking place at official level rather than at ministerial level. But that's my supposition.
Can we look, please, just moving forward to February 99 then, at poll 30690088. And just highlight the top of the page. Now, this wouldn't have been an email that you heard, that you saw at the time. You're not on the copy list. It's not something that would have come to your attention. It's the content that I want to ask you about, Mr. Milburn. Do you understand? And so this is from Jonathan Evans, and he recalls that he states that David Sibic, senior civil servant in the DTI, rang late this afternoon to tell me that you had earlier today passed to Stephen Byers a proposal for a way forwards on Horizon. Byers has until lunchtime tomorrow to give comments back to the Treasury. Darling at DSS is in a similar position. The proposal is strictly confidential to ministers and officials. The Treasury has not given clearance for us or the benefits agency to be brought into the consultation net. I went this evening over to DTI with Mina to help David analyse what the proposal contains. Contrary to rumours, it doesn't contain any suggestion of involving a new partner, but is essentially option X with a twist, and then that's set out, scrap the benefit payment card, Pockle to introduce a smart card, benefit payments to be paid into a benefit account via ACT. Initially, the benefit account would only be accessible at post offices. ACT into normal bank accounts would remain an option throughout. Now, this tends to suggest sort of back channels of communication going on. To what extent did you know about that?
I didn't. And in fact, I don't know who any of these characters are.
Right. Would you expect such back channels of communication to go on at an official level and including back to ICL?
I don't know back to ICL, but the real politique of being in government and being any large organisation is that there are always back channels, are there not? So it doesn't particularly surprise me that officials were talking privately to one another.
Now, you know that subsequently data produced by, that can be taken down, thank you, data produced by the Horizon system was used to as the foundation for the prosecution of a number of sub-postmasters, sub-postmistresses and Crown Office staff. In the 9-month period of your office as Chief Secretary, was that something that you were aware of, that the data produced by the system could be used for that purpose?
No.
Did you know that the Post Office was a prosecuting authority, that it conducted its own investigations and prosecutions rather than that being done by the police service and the Crown Prosecution Service?
At the time, no.
Were you aware of any discussions at the time as to the need to ensure the integrity and reliability of the data processed by the Horizon system, because it might be put to that use?
No.
And so were you viewing this through the lens simply of an ordinary, in inverted commas, computer system that would be used for the processing of transactions and accounting purposes?
Sure.
Would it have made any difference if you had known the things that I've just mentioned, i.e. a different use to which the data might be put?
Yes, I would have thought so. I mean, when but I'm struggling to answer the question because I'm trying to think what I would have thought then, so to speak, 20 odd years ago. But when I read the transcript of the evidence that my colleague Stephen Byers had given here, and when you raised exactly those same questions about the Post Office as a prosecuting authority and the use to which data had been put, I was going to say I was surprised, I was shocked. And so I may well have had the same reaction 20 odd years ago.
There were a number of discussions between the DTI and the Benefits Agency about the needs and duties of the different organisations, and therefore what was necessary for the, in terms of the specification and outputs of the Horizon system. This wasn't included as one of them, so far as you're aware.
Not as far as I'm aware.
And so you didn't have any information drawn to your attention that would satisfy you that the Horizon system would be fit for the purpose of providing reliable evidence for use in criminal and indeed in civil cases?
No.
This wasn't an issue that was on your radar in any sense at all?
From recollection, absolutely not. And I'm pretty certain that if it had been, if I had been apprised of that, I think I probably would have remembered it in the light of what has happened.
I'm not going to take you through the various iterations of the developments of proposals in the period between January and May 1999, because we've got those on paper, and you've said in your witness statement, you've repeated today, that you have very little independent recollection to add to those. But I do want to take you to the end of the process, if I may, to
Sure.
the position in May 1999, and look at HMT 6024. And if we go to the last page of that, which is page 9, we can see that it's signed off by you. There would have been your signature underneath where it says General Restriction Order, GRO, and it's dated the 10th of May, 1999.
Yep.
Would you have drafted this, or would somebody have drafted it for you?
Oh, it would have been drafted for me. And then I may well have edited it and changed it or whatever, but there would have been an initial draft that would have come up to my office.
And so, because you may have edited it, amended it, but then signed it, you were content with the content going out in your name?
Yes.
If we go back to page 1, thank you. It says in the introduction, the note sets out the current situation on the Horizon project. It summarises the extensive work that's taken place over the last few weeks to reach an agreement about how best to proceed. In summarising the position, I've consulted extensively with Stephen Byers, Alistair Darling and Charlie Faulkner. Now, at this stage, what was your role? So, 10th of May 1999.
That's a very good question. I guess I was trying to act as a broker and convener between the different interests and points of view amongst my ministerial colleagues. And in that role, my co-pilot, I suppose, was Charlie Faulkner, because he was a minister for the Cabinet Office. So again, sat at the centre of government rather than representing one of the departments. So we each had a finger in the pie. I think this letter is interesting because it represents my attempt, I suppose, to bring matters to a conclusion by facing the Prime Minister with a choice, because, as is clear from the other content of this particular letter, although we might have been aligned on many things, we couldn't get to an alignment about the best way forward, whether it was B1, B3 or termination. And so, in the end, the ultimate arbiter in government has to be the Prime Minister, which is why the letter was sent.
Thank you. You continue, we have a commitment to give ICL a decision on the way forward with this project on Monday, but ICL have said they can now wait till Tuesday. They must file end-year accounts on Wednesday. Just stopping there, what was the relevance of ICL filing accounts?
Because not from memory, but from a reading of the papers, depending on what was agreed, they would have to make a provision in their accounts. And indeed, I think Fujitsu would have had to make a provision in its accounts.
For losses?
For losses.
And depending on the choice that government made, that may determine the extent of the loss shown.
Correct.
You continue, our policy aim is to move to ACT as soon as reasonably practical and to preserve a national post office network. And you, in your witness statement, I think you describe certainly the latter of those as one of the top-level policy objectives, the preservation of a national post office network. The former of those, our policy aim is to move to ACT as soon as practical. Was that a reflection of the DSS's position?
I think it was spearheaded by the DSS, but I think there was a recognition that the current method of paying benefits at the time, through the sort of so-called ration book method, was inefficient, was out of sync with where benefit agency customers themselves were going, and was both expensive and vulnerable to fraud. So I think there was a cross-government recognition that the preferable route was to move to ACT, and not just a DSS one.
And then turning to the options. Sorry, before that it says we should keep. If that could just be blown up again. Thank you. We should keep ICL Fujitsu on board if possible. Then turning to the options, we'll come to these in more detail when we get to the papers. Substance itself. Stephen Byers and Charlie Faulkner both prefer option B1. We'll come to that in a moment, but that's a new smart card, essentially.
Yeah.
Alistair Darling and Alan Milburn favour option B3. We'll come to that. That's Pockle buying system from ICL, but without the benefit payment card.
Which is sort of what eventually happened.
Yeah, that was the outcome.
Yes.
If Pockle and ICL can reach a sensible deal, if they can't, they would favour option C, termination, and allowing Pockle to procure a new system that met their commercial requirements in the light of termination. The sentence, Alistair Darling and Alan Milburn favour option 3, that you presumably don't refer to yourself much in the third person.
It's a slightly odd way of doing it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Is that a reflection that this is authored by somebody else, or would that be the normal way to write?
No, it isn't a reflection of the fact that it was written by someone else. I think it's a reflection of the fact that I wanted to make clear to the Prime Minister where the principles stood.
I'm so sorry, sir. Once again, the transcript appears to have stopped. That's IT.
I'm glad you said that, not me.
Sorry, can you give me a moment to find out what's going on? I understand on this occasion that the transcription link is working, and so the transcriber will carry on transcribing, which is obviously the critical thing, that there is a record made of.
That's why I asked the question earlier, because I think we can all survive not having a simultaneous...
The live note.
Exactly. Whew, as they say.
Yes, picking up where we were then.
Yes.
I think you were mid-answer.
Yes, I was saying that I think the reason that it's a slightly odd, a letter coming from me referring to me in the third person. I think I was trying to make it explicitly clear to the Prime Minister, who I'm sure was receiving a lot of submissions at this time, where the individual principles stood.
I understand. If they can't then reach a deal, then termination.
So Alistair and I took the view, which wasn't the same view as Steve or Charlie, we took the view that if we couldn't make what was eventually the option that was implemented work, then we had to move to termination.
Background, we gave an assurance to Fujitsu that the government will make a decision. I'm dealing with this in some detail because we've skipped over the various iterations of the run-up to this moment.
Yes.
And then over the page, please. On the way forward for the project by Monday, which is, I think, the day of the document itself, although ICL have now said they can wait until Tuesday. Economic case, the Horizon project was envisaged as a way of reducing benefit fraud and modernising the benefit system while automating the post office network in a way that would help preserve footfall and therefore maintain a nationwide network of post offices. It's now 3 years late. Our view is that continuation with the project, option A, is no longer viable in view of ICL's failure to deliver and the irretrievable breakdown in relation between the parties. This view was effectively confirmed earlier this week when ICL withdrew their offer of the 18th of December. It's therefore dead. The sentence continuation is no longer viable in view of ... the irretrievable breakdown in relations between the parties. Did you consider when making recommendations, when writing this minute, whether the irretrievable breakdown in relations between the parties didn't just include an irretrievable breakdown involving the Benefits Agency and DSS, that there was there had been a breakdown in relations between POCL and ICL?
I don't know.
Can you recall what this breakdown is focused on?
I think it's principally focused on, I would have thought it's focused on the breakdown between the Benefits Agency and ICL.
Were you aware of any breakdown in relations between POCL and ICL?
I honestly can't recollect.
Moving on, paragraph 3, we're left with 3 options. First, B1, involving the creation of 15 million post office benefits accounts with limited facilities accessible via a post office smart card. Benefits would be paid into these accounts by ACT from 2002. It's the best option to preserve post office footfall in the short term, and the policy value for this cannot be reflected in the figures. It would place the Post Office in a position to win electronic government services by having a base of 15 million smart cards. It provides automation of counter services. In this respect, it has attractions, but it offers considerably worse value for money in NPV, net present value, terms than the alternative options. If ministers were to decide to pursue option B1, ICL's current position is that the public sector parties must sign an unconditional agreement on Tuesday and provide ICL with £180 million. You didn't favour this option.
No.
And why?
Because I thought the conditions, because I think the reasons why I didn't favour this option, given it was so long ago, were that the conditions were unattractive, signing up unconditionally to something that was going to be complex to deliver, didn't seem to me to be a recipe for success. And the fact that ICL once again were wanting more when they had a track record of delivering less. So that was one reason. I guess the second reason was that in cost terms, and not just in NPV terms, but in public expenditure terms, as I've read from the papers, this would be a considerably more expensive option than either continuing with what was, which was clearly not an option because it had failed, and for all the reasons that we've been discussing, or the option that I did favour, B3.
Could we turn then to B3 over the page, please? Paragraph 4. The second option, B3, would involve POCL buying the basic system from ICL, but without the benefit payment application and without the creation of special POCL benefit accounts. It will provide automation of post office counters from bill payment to postage rates. Benefits will be paid into conventional high street banks by ECT. The post office would offer simple cashback facilities as a minimum to access these accounts across the counter. It would also provide a platform for network banking and modern government with a smart card capability, though it would not provide the certainty of 15 million smart cards as under B1. It would allow the benefits agency to roll out the order book control system, a way of reducing order book fraud. BA and POCL would work together to market ACT into bank accounts accessible at the post office from 2001 in preparation for a move to ACT as the usual method of payment in 2003. The net present value figures are sensitive to changes in these dates. And then 5, unlike B1, B3 would not tie the post office to ICL as a long-term business partner. Such a time may well prove inflexible if and when we take forward a public-private partnership and therefore force us to bring in a private sector partner on less attractive terms. Down the page, please, to 6. POCL reject option 3 at the moment, and ICL have indicated it's likely to be expensive. POCL would prefer termination and to obtain a new system better suited to their needs. Can you recall why POCL rejected option B3?
I can't, I'm afraid.
In order to maintain progress on B3, we would have to rule option B1 off the table and make plain that termination was the only alternative. However, when this was done over the weekend, POCL still preferred termination. It's unlikely we could force POCL to do B3. In fact, that's what happened, isn't it?
It is, yes. I think I was wrong in that regard.
Yes. You were wrong in which regard?
In regard to the last sentence. Because in the end, yes, that is what happened.
Over the page, please, to 7. The third option, C, would be to terminate the contracts with ICL. POCL would start afresh. New automation system would be brought forward from a new supplier specifically designed to meet POCL's automation and banking applications, including the ability to withdraw cash from bank accounts at post offices. BA would be given a date to move to ACT. They would like to start the transfer from 2001, although POCL say they could not be ready by then and claim they would lose substantial footfall, working with POCL to maximise retention of footfall. As well as the above considerations, there are substantial economic and financial differences between the options. The key figures are, over the page please, and if we just scroll down to look at the table, I'm not going to analyse the financial figures or ask you to do so.
It's a relief.
And you enter a footnote saying all these figures should be seen as indicative rather than precise forecasts. They depend on assumptions. And then if we go over the page to the summary, B3 and C offer a better economic return than B1. The cash hit under B3 and C are significantly less than under B1, both in the CSR2 period and over a 10-year timescale. So that's the headline points that you draw from the table before,
yes,
which is why I'm not going to try and deconstruct it.
Yes.
You then come on to the Post Office's position. They prefer B1, but are not prepared to contribute more than £37 million. They've suggested that a further £190 million be taken from their customers by delaying the reduction in the postal monopoly from £1 to 50p by 3 years. Could you explain what that means, please?
I honestly can't recall. I don't know.
Okay, the Post Office have said they will plough the net contribution they expect to make from government direct business under A back into B1 and estimate there'll be about £660 million. But this money is already taken into account in calculating the additional costs in the table above. ICL are offering the possibility to finance to smooth the the spending profile, but this is simply borrowing from ICL, and the interest payments will add to the project costs. And then you analyse under a series of headings the political factors, positions, and then conclusions. And I just want to go back to political factors, please, on page 10. Paragraph 10 at the foot of the page. All of the options need to be presented very carefully, given the expectation amongst sub-postmasters that Horizon would secure their future. B1 would be the easiest of the other three options to handle. B3 would be the harder, but it would still have ICL on board, and the Post Office would still be getting automation. In the case of B3 and C, the government would need to argue that it would have been doing the Post Office and its customers no good by pressing on with a project that was already 3 years late and couldn't deliver, and that they were fully committed to providing one that did. We would make plain that ICL had withdrawn the existing project. We have looked hard to salvage something, but unfortunately there was nothing worthwhile. And then continue on positions. This reflects what you'd said in the summary at the beginning. We can skip 11, which sets out Mr. Byers and Mr. Falconer's position, and go to 12, which I think explains the answer in more detail to the question that I asked you earlier, why you favoured B1. You and Alistair Darling consider that the larger funding gap with B1 and the fact that it ties the Post Office into an expensive project over a period during which we might consider a change in the ownership present too much of a downside. They consider the Post Office's lack of financial commitment raises doubts about their commitment to B1. They're concerned that ICL's failure to deliver the BPC on time does not bode well for the delivery of a new and complex system. And then this, in contrast, B3 would be buying that part of the system that is ready to roll out and is relatively simple. That phrase there, ready to roll out, can you recall where that came from? Bearing in mind this is 10th of May 99.
I can't recall where it came from. I think it's a reference to the fact that B3 effectively involved the separation of the BPC, which had been the subject of many of the problems from, if you like, the underlying automation of post office counters. So I think it's a relativity point rather than an absolute one, I think, reading it again.
Could I just test that a little bit? Is that your recollection of what you had been told, whether orally or through submissions, that the problems with Horizon principally related to the BPC, rather than the benefits agency having an in-principle objection to the use of the BPC?
I don't, I'm afraid, have a direct recollection. I mean, reading the documentation now, some 20-odd years later, I think a recurring theme from what I've read is that the BPC was identified as the core problem, and it is perfectly obvious that from a benefit agencies and DSS point of view, the longer the delays were in the BPC, which was always regarded as an interim solution, pending ACT and or a full smart card, the less the value was for the DSS and the benefits agency in terms, for example, of fraud, savings from fraud. So understandably, perhaps the DSS and the benefits agency were getting more and more frustrated as time went on.
And then the sentence, or the part of the sentence, and is relatively simple, i.e. the Horizon system stripped of the BPC element of it was relatively simple. On what basis was that said?
I presume it was said on the basis that that is what I was being told, that it was a more straightforward part of Horizon than the BPC. But that's a presumption rather than a recollection.
I mean, presumably you wouldn't have said this unless you had been told it.
I wouldn't have made it up, no.
No. You continue, B3 could also provide a platform for modern government. The option A savings, largely accruing to the benefits agency, are also available under B3 and C. At 13, the Post Office favour B1. They've said they're not interested in B3 and would prefer termination. This may partly be a negotiating tactic. They were reluctant to consider other options while option A was on the table. If POCL and ICL can't agree on a worthwhile deal on B3, there would be termination. Did you consider that the Post Office were employing negotiating tactics with government?
I guess that's what that infers, but I don't have a recollection of that.
To what extent was it for government to make a decision here, given that the Post Office was a statutory corporation and Post Office Counters Limited was a limited company with its own board? Why does government get to make the choice and foist it upon an unwilling company limited by guarantee?
Well, it's clearly an uncomfortable position, not least because the then government's position was that, as I recall, we wanted to give greater freedom to the Post Office in order to encourage it to be more entrepreneurial and more modern in order to sustain itself and be successful for the future. But the real answer is that in the end, the buck stops with the government, and indeed the checkbook is owned by the government. So someone was going to have to write the checks on behalf of the taxpayer, and that is HMG.
Sorry, we should finish with the conclusion. We've been unable to agree on an option. B1's favoured by ICL and the Post Office, but has a substantial funding gap. It provides the most immediate security of footfall, but ties the Post Office into a long-term relationship. B3 provides an automated platform for POCL to develop its business in the future. It's clearly more affordable than B1, but is currently opposed by Post Office and possibly by ICL. C would provide POCL with a made-to-measure automation system, is more affordable than B1, but would mean the end of ICL's involvement in the contracts and could have more presentational difficulties. You continue in 15. We've set in train a handling strategy to ensure the best possible presentation from government's point of view, regardless of which option is eventually agreed. And then essentially over to you.
That is essentially what that last paragraph says.
Now, attached to one version of this minute to the Prime Minister are some handling lines, some lines to take. Can we look, please, at CBO 6058? And go to page 7, please. Q&A. If ICL Fujitsu decide to withdraw, and if we go forwards within those Q&As to page 11, please. And if we could just blow that up a bit. I'm sorry that this is presented in this way. It's a photograph of a file within the National Archive. This, I think, handling line says independent reviews of the Horizon project by external IT experts have all concluded most recently this week that ICL Pathway have failed and are failing to meet good industry practice in taking this project forward, both in their software development work and in their management of the process. What did you know about that IT experts concluded most recently that week that ICL Pathway had failed to meet good industry practice?
I don't think I did.
And then there's a list of 8 or so bullet points. To date, in the development stages of the project, 1, all planned release dates have been missed, including the key contractual milestone for completion of the operational trial, for which ICL were placed in breach in November 97. On current working plans, updated as recently as September 99, the first milestone thereafter, model office testing, was delayed by 2 months. Every release has been subject to reductions in the originally planned functionality. Even when each release has gone live, there have been faults and problems which have resulted in the need for Pathway to reimburse TSS. In the current trials, the known problems have risen from 46 in November 98 to 139 at the end of March, and currently 146 have not been resolved. Nearly 16 million people should by now be paid the benefit payment card. In fact, only 30,000 people plus are currently being paid by the benefit payment card, and for one benefit only. Rollout of the system to 19,000 post offices should have been completed at the end of 98, but only limited functionality is available currently in 204 post offices, and delays to the programme have already cost the government over £200 million in savings they would have otherwise have expected to make. That list of ICL failures, as it's put, was it ever put to you in that way?
Not that I can recall.
Do you know whether that kind of information, that list of ICL failures, was taken into account in the decision-making by you and then the Prime Minister, as opposed to being listed as points to make in press handling lines in the event that ICL pulled out?
I think what we were made aware of was less the inputs, this list, and more the outcome, which was the substantial delays and, of course, the breach of contract.
Yes, they're the only questions that I ask you about the final stage of the process there. Before I hand over to any other call participants that wish to ask you questions, have you any other reflections that you wish to pass on to the inquiry about this episode insofar as you were involved in it?
I think only that from a government point of view, government tends to work, this is maybe a debatable point, government tends to work reasonably well when it's departmentally focused. Where government struggles is when there are cross-departmental issues. And this was a cross-departmental issue, as is perfectly clear from this, even this last note that you refer to, Mr. Vere. I think my reflections, given the appalling injustices that have happened, are really threefold on lessons. One is this clarity point. Secondly, in other words, there should be clarity and accountability rather than a fudge. Fudges don't work and they tend to come undone. The second is about risk and risk appraisal, because this was always going to be a high-risk endeavour, just given the complexity of it. And again, I don't know what was agreed or how it was agreed, because we don't have access. We've never had access to any of those papers because they were agreed by the previous administration. But risk appraisal, therefore, becomes absolutely a critical thing. And indeed, it should be an ongoing thing, in my view. I think risk appraisal is often viewed as something that happens at the beginning of a program or a project, and then it's done and dusted. But risk appraisal needs to take place throughout, and the consequences or the results of risk appraisal need to be openly and transparently shared. And the third point is, which is the point you were exploring with me earlier, was there sufficient independent technical expertise available to government to allow ministers in particular to have an informed view about technologically, was this thing actually working in practice or not? And that, it seems to me, was a missing piece of the architecture. Now, as I say, I have no idea, frankly, whether any of those 3 points nowadays are reflected in how HMG goes about operationalising major procurements of this sort. Maybe it does. I just don't know. But those seem to me to be the pertinent points that at least I would take away from a reading of all the documentation that's been made available to me by the inquiry.
Mr. Milburn, thank you very much. I think there may be some questions from one or maybe two of the other call participants. Thank you. Mr. Steen to start with.
Mr. Milburn, I represent a large group of ex-sub-postmasters, mistresses and managers. My name is Sam Steen. I just want to target one particular area. You've been asked a few questions at the beginning of your evidence today regarding how documents are sorted out before, if they get to you at all, they get to you. This is not a new matter for you in terms of giving evidence. You gave evidence at the infected blood inquiry on the 14th of July of this year. And this very topic was spoken about then.
It was.
I'm sure that some things that you dealt with as a minister were not disasters, but in terms of
it's very generous.
In terms of the infected blood inquiry and the post office inquiry, that I'll just paraphrase, and I've got to note the transcript of your evidence at the infected blood inquiry. The way you put it there was that you would say, as a rule of thumb, the vast majority of papers that were copied to the Secretary of State's private office were never seen by the Secretary of State. You also then spoke about the civil servant side of it, and you gave an example of Charles Lister, who in fact now Sir Charles, who would consider documents and take a strategic view as to whether it should go to you or not. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the way you went on to describe it rather usefully is this. You put that in relation to Sir Charles as being that's the first bucket of who saw what. And that would be primarily a decision that would be taken by an official. The second set of decision makers would be junior ministers, and they would have to decide how comfortable they were about owning a set of issues. And so these different ways would be different filter systems, either filter so that you don't see them, or indeed filtering through so that you do. Is that correct?
Yes.
Well, I think I can leave it there. In a way, I'm using your evidence as a way of making a point that the effective blood inquiry and, to a lesser extent, the Grenfell inquiry have all looked at these self-same issues of what information is given to ministers, how they receive it, how it is sorted out, and who gets what. And
yes.
It may be an area that this inquiry would like to look into in terms of the evidence before other inquiries.
Sure. I mean, I think the only, and you know, it's good of you to cite the evidence that I gave just a few months ago. I mean, all my time, by the way, isn't spent at public inquiries. It feels like that on occasions, but somebody said to me that ministers have two careers. They have a career making decisions, then 25 years later they have a career defending them in front of public inquiries. But I think, you know, there's method in the madness. You know, it's difficult, I think, for people to understand who haven't been in government just how much stuff there is. You know, you're getting a lot of stuff coming at you all the time, and there's a lot of correspondence, a lot of nowadays emails, and so on and so forth. So there does have to be some filtering mechanism, you know, because otherwise you're faced with an avalanche that it's just impossible to deal with. The problem is that that's not always transparent, and it must be very frustrating for individuals and organisations who write to ministers never to get a reply from them, for example. Maybe never to get a reply from anyone, I don't know. It isn't transparent, and as you say, it isn't always obvious what are the criteria by which decisions are eventually put to ministers rather than being dealt with by officials. I think that's an interesting area to explore.
And in fact, the way you put it in the effective blood inquiry was you described it as being more an art than a science.
I think that is probably right. And in part, you know, in truth, I don't want to in any way give the impression that ministers are victims in all of this, because in the end, look, you're in government, you know, you're responsible for what happens in your department. That's the rule of the games, so to speak. Even though very often, to be perfectly honest, there are things that are happening in your department that you have absolutely zero line of sight of, because it's almost impossible to have any line of sight of it. So, yeah, it's...
Lawyers and judges often think that we're quite busy people. Have you ever been busier than you were as a Secretary of State?
It's crazy. I mean, it's a crazy way of life. I mean, it's, you know, I mean, I think there's a reference to Alistair and Steve and I on Christmas Eve having a conflab about whatever it was in relation to Horizon. That wouldn't be unusual. There's another reference somewhere to meeting at 12:30 in the morning, trying to cobble together a decision. I mean, these are not unusual things. So it's a very intense thing to do. It's the most purposeful thing I've ever done in my life, and I don't regret a moment of it. But it's pretty busy.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
No, thank you, sir.
On that last point, Mr. Milburn, I haven't yet got any idea to the extent I will investigate the sifting mechanism that you've been describing. But my immediate impression of your evidence is, or could be summarized in this way, and I just want to make sure I've got it right. There's an absolute need for a sifting mechanism, but the fact of it should be more transparent.
Yes, I think that would be fair. I mean,
quite how you make it transparent is quite another thing. I agree, but are those the 2 points you were seeking to make?
Yes, I think that's a fair way of putting it. I think there's always a risk that, particularly in a situation like this, all of us in this room have the great blessing of hindsight. And, you know, even in my own answers, it's sometimes difficult to disentangle what I'm thinking about it today from what I may well have been thinking about it then. So I think there's always a bit of a risk that we come up with answers and structures that are too didactic. and that don't provide, to the point that was just made, sufficient flexibility, because the truth is, it is art and not just science. So you've got to be careful, I think, about over-prescribing as well.
When I was a law student, I spent many hours grappling with the concept of foreseeability. I'm reminding myself of that virtually every hour of every day.
I'm sure.
Thank you, Mr. Beer.
Thank you very much, sir. Can we take the morning break now for until 2:15?
Certainly.
And
yeah.
the next witness is Mr. Peberdy.
Yeah, fine. Whenever you're ready.
Chair, our next witness is Mr. John Peberdy.
Yeah.
And take the Bible in your right hand. Repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Peberdy, you should have a copy of your witness statement in front of you. Do you?
Yes, I do.
And if you turn to the last page, is that your signature there?
It is.
Have you read through this statement recently?
I have.
And is it true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
It is.
Can I start by thanking you for coming here to give evidence to the inquiry and for preparing that statement? Everything that I now ask you is supplementary to that. You were a sub-postmaster until 2008 when you retired, is that right?
That is correct.
When did you start as a sub-postmaster?
1980.
And you say in your statement that you were at one time chairman of the NFSP negotiating committee. Do you remember when you held that position?
To be truthful, as it's now 26 years ago, I believe it started in the mid-1990s.
You were also president of the NFSP in 1998.
Correct.
And was that just for the year of 1998?
It was, I believe, longer than that.
What did that role as president involve?
Well, I suppose actually of the Federation, the President is actually sort of the figurehead and obviously conducted all meetings of the Executive Council, or chaired all meetings of the Executive Council, and actually probably visited lots of branches of the Federation throughout the country, sometimes as a guest, to either meetings to address them, social functions, dinner dances, etc.
What about the role of chairman of the negotiating committee? What did that involve?
Right, quite a lot different situation in that negotiating committee was a small committee who, by the name, as the name implies, negotiated terms and conditions of sub-postmasters with the Post Office. And of course, in the wider implications as time moved on, meetings with various government departments, DTI, etc. And working fairly closely with the General Secretary at the time, who was Colin Baker.
At the time that Horizon was being developed, were you aware that sub-postmasters could be prosecuted by the Post Office?
There was always a case, even in previous days, when manual cash accounts, as they were done, that sub-postmasters who were held responsible for the cash and stock under their control, if a shortage was discovered by auditors on a visit to the Post Office, there was a likelihood that, depending on the severity of that and decisions that the Post Office took, yes, they could be prosecuted.
And they could also recover their losses as well prior to Horizon?
Yes.
You say in your statement, if we could pull that up, it's WITN 038000100. And if we look at paragraph 19, which is on page 4, please. Thank you. at paragraph 19, you say, during early 1999, there were major cost implications facing the Horizon project. These were not helped by the fact that the BA/DSS and to some part the Treasury wanted to pull out of the Horizon scheme because they wanted to pursue the payment of benefits by automated credit transfer into bank accounts, which they saw as a much cheaper alternative. Did you understand that to be the sole reason for the BA or DSS pulling out of the project?
From what I can remember was that the benefits agency always perceived the post office network as expensive to them, and therefore they were examining automated credit transfer. And I believe that one of the big drivers was that the benefits agency weren't wanting to fund the project and wanting to fund the post office network to the degree that it was at that time.
Were you aware of issues with testing requirements that the BA had raised at the time?
Whilst I wasn't directly aware, because weren't being being consulted on those issues, obviously we knew that the whole of the project had to have a test and was being tested, yes.
At this time, did you think that the future of the post office was at risk by the withdrawal of the BA from this project?
Very much so, yeah.
And what were the problems that you saw at that time with that withdrawal?
Well, obviously, sub-postmasters, by their very nature, had bought their businesses, some with associated retail businesses attached to, some to a bigger or lesser degree. I, of course, was a sub-postmaster. And therefore was a considerable investment into the network, and the network was very much loved by the government. So the implications of losing a main income stream to sub-postmasters was one that didn't bear counting at the time.
And did you feel it was important that the Horizon project went ahead and was brought into post offices?
Yes, very much so. Obviously, the simple reason being that the post office needed bringing into the modern era, I will agree, and we as a Federation of Sub-Postmasters were extremely keen that the network was automated, because on the back of the payment of benefits to the public was the wider implication of other automated transactions which could be undertaken, and therefore hopefully protecting that network.
You were part of the Horizon Working Group with Colin Baker, is that right?
That's correct.
And if we could pull up NFSP 6064, please. This is a letter sent to Colin Baker inviting him to join that group. Before we look at the text, what in your mind was the purpose of this working group and your role on it?
From what I can remember at the time, it was obviously to try and make sure that the Horizon project went into the network in a smooth fashion, and also because of the concerns that were being expressed at the time, that others became involved to try and dig deeper into the project.
So did you see your role as assisting with it getting it over the line rather than with identifying problems that arose?
I believe that it was getting, yes, I'll take your expression, getting it over the line, far more than actually looking at any problems that were involved at that time.
If we could look at the last two paragraphs of the letter, please, if we could blow that up. This states that first, there were three main areas. First, the negotiations between POCL and ICL and between POCL and BA. That need to take place over the next few weeks to put in place a detailed contractual arrangements that will give effect to the outline agreement reached on the 24th of May, I see a role for the working group in carefully monitoring these negotiations and addressing and helping to resolve any sticking points that may be encountered. The second area covers the remaining development phases of Horizon, including large-scale live trials, system acceptance and rollout of the system smoothly and in a timely fashion to all officers within the network, followed by the migration from paper-based methods of benefit payment to ACT-based payments accessible at post offices. I believe that the working group could provide a valuable forum for bringing pressure to bear where needed and for seeking solutions to any problems that may arise. If we could turn on to the next page, please, and the first paragraph. The third area concerns the commercial exploitation of the very considerable potential which the Horizon platform will offer once in place. The combined experience of the working group should provide a valuable source of ideas and contracts for business opportunities and future revenue streams. Do those three objectives reflect what you understood at the time to be the purpose of this group?
Yes, because they were what had been obviously communicated to us under the terms of reference. Yes.
How did you find working on the working group at the time? What was your experience?
I do believe that we might have been described as a uncomfortable bed partner, in so much as it felt a bit like that the NFSP ought to be on board, because there were those there who thought that in many instances we could do more damage than good, and therefore partially I felt as a bit of a placater.
If we could turn up the next document, which is NFSP 50479, please. This is a minute of the meeting of the negotiating committee on the 10th of June 1999. And if we could turn to page 9, please. We can see that this is where the discussion on counter-automation begins. Was this something that was regularly discussed or a standing item at the negotiation committee, at least at this time?
Yes, it was a regular agenda item.
And what was the purpose of that, for you to provide an update?
Yes, it was to provide an update to either the negotiating committee, as in this instance, and it was also a regular item on the full Executive Council agenda. Therefore, either updating the negotiating committee on work which the General Secretary might have been involved directly, or that the General Secretary and I had been involved in, so that the full negotiating committee were appraised of where we were going at that time.
And if we could turn to page 12, please. And at the bottom of that page, it says the General Secretary and John Peberdy advised the committee that they had gone to the meeting, it's the working group meeting, with the preconceived ideas that attempts would be made to buy them off and placate them with platitudes. However, it appears that the government are worried, and if we could go over the page and the top, yes, thank you, about the extent of the Federation's influence, and it's our intention to keep them worried. The Federation has a substantial role in the working group and will be in a prime position to have as much influence as possible. The Minister is under no illusion that the Federation intends to bide its time and see what is to be delivered before taking any further action. Is that what you felt at the time, that the Federation had a great deal of influence in the working group?
I felt that probably generally, if I can sort of expand on it a little, as the role of the Federation, the Federation were, as I said earlier, the conduit for negotiating with Post Office Counters Limited. But we fortunately, probably through partially General Secretary and others, and had a reasonable dialogue with government departments and government ministers and even higher. And we had courted this, we had furthered it, because at that time, the post office network, in my opinion, was the Achilles heel of the government. Nobody wanted to shut a village post office. Nobody wanted to shut a post office. So any method to keep them open and bearing in mind the government had made a pledge to keep a nationwide network of post office open, was there. So I felt that because we had that, if I may call it an in, to other avenues other than the post office, we were very much involved in things like the Horizon Working Group, as that actually said, and as I said earlier, to placate the Federation as much as anything else.
Thank you. Could we bring that page back up, please? So that's NFSP 500479 and page 13, please. Thank you. This is the same page that we were on. If we look further down the page, it says some sub-postmasters have had enormous difficulties balancing up and finishing their cash accounts, even to the point of still struggling to finish on Friday nights. Tomorrow's special executive council meeting, which is being attended for a short time by Stuart Sweetman and David Miller, is crucial to finding out what has gone wrong with the Horizon programme. ICL Pathway and POCL say it's not the system. Do you remember what was happening at this time and the issues that were being flagged by sub-postmasters?
Yes, and probably from my own experience as a sub-postmaster, although I was not very often in my own office and it was run by a person that I employed. What had become a great problem was we always had to balance our post offices on a Friday evening, and the Horizon system had just lengthened that tremendously. I had being reported to me by other sub-postmasters staying in their offices till late at night, even 10:30, because it churned and churned and churned before it produced anything that gave a clue as to whether your office was balancing that week or not.
Was that something that concerned you?
Very much so.
Turning forward then to the meeting the next day, if we could pull up NFSP 50539. Thank you. So this is a report of the special meeting of the National Executive Committee. And if we turn forward to page 7, this is when David Miller and Stuart Sweetman joined the meeting. Do you remember this meeting?
Being a long while ago, to say I remember it fully would be not the correct statement, but I do remember them attending a meeting, and yes.
And we can see that there was a list of questions that were put to Mr. Sweetman and Mr. Miller. And if we could turn over to page 10, please. We can see that a Mr. Butlin referred to the serious problems that the South West was having with the software, especially with the balance, and asked Mr. Miller whether any changes were to be made in that respect. An assurance was sought by the committee that the balance would become more user-friendly, more logical and easier for sub-postmasters to use. Would it be possible for sub-postmasters to have more input into the way that balance was done? The South East was facing similar problems. Sub-postmasters were incurring additional staff costs, an example being around 350 in the 4 weeks that his office had been up and running. This specific problem of balancing on Horizon, at this stage, how high up your priority list was it?
I think if you took it on a scale of 1 to 10, it probably sat at 8, because probably the highest priority was actually getting that Horizon system fully rolled out. But anything that was flagged up to us as a federation as a problem for sub-postmasters was obviously something we had to take on board. And those who were spending hours paying extra staff costs, for example, because they were waiting for this Horizon system to churn out what was thought to be a balance, was not acceptable. And obviously Mr. Butlin was drawing Dave Miller's attention to it in the hope that we could get some assurances. He did ask, as you've just read out, I noticed, that could we be involved or could we have some further input? And that, of course, was never really ever taken up directly as a direct input.
When you say it wasn't taken up directly, what do you mean by that?
Well, we weren't, as a federation, in a position to be dealing directly with ICL Pathway or anybody on the project directly to make input of that nature. All the Federation's input on behalf of sub-postmasters was obviously done through Post Office Counters Limited.
If we could turn to page 14, please. We can see that at this meeting, 3 paragraphs down, that there was a vote that was taken on whether the Federation should continue to work with the Post Office or against it. Do you remember that taking place?
Directly, I cannot remember it specifically, but the minute will record it faithfully, I am sure.
And if we look at the bottom of the page, it says Miss Linden referred to the controversy concerning the plans for Horizon and questioned whether the Federation was getting the package they needed. She suggested that this being negotiation time was an opportunity, thank you, for POCL to talk to ICL Pathway about modifying and simplifying the package before it was too late. The chairman advised that Mr. Miller had requested a list of all the problems with the software and that he would address them and talk to sub-postmasters to see what they wanted on the programme. He was embarrassed that this had not happened already. It was important that members be advised immediately of the outcome of this meeting, and this needed to be done in a way that would make them aware of the seriousness of the situation without resorting to scaremongering. Was it ever seriously considered by the NFSP that you should really be asking for a new system rather than working with the Horizon system, given the feedback?
Whilst there have been various private systems for balancing post offices out there, there was nothing on the scale of Horizon, the ICL Pathway project. And I think the system was that we were so aware that the benefits agency were wanting to move away, if they could, from paying benefits over post office counters, that we felt we had got to work to make this work and make it right. And I think that was our position at that time.
So what you're saying is there wasn't really an option to say, let's scrap this and start again?
I don't think we had the power to take that route. We could make Post Office Counters Limited aware of everything that was going on, and did so on numerous occasions. And I know that for a fact our General Secretary was probably regularly on the phone to various people within Post Office Counters Limited. And as I've said, I think in my witness statement, a lot of meetings that we had when we raised points with Post Office Counters Limited, they were unfortunately at unminuted meetings or meetings that we haven't had, to my knowledge, minutes of.
If we could move forward to the National Executive Council meeting on the 24th, 22nd and 23rd of June. That's NFSP 50471. And if we could move to page 22, please. You'll see there at the bottom the topic of counter-automation comes up. How do you remember this meeting?
Yes, I remember that it was a meeting that we were going to report further on, and as that minute, when I read part of the bundle, refreshed my memory to some degree to some of those meetings.
If we could look over the page on page 23. Halfway down the page, there was general discussion on the severe difficulties being experienced by sub-postmasters who are already running an automated system. 7 sheets of comments from the North East have been passed to Dave Miller. The difficulties and trauma being experienced by some sub-postmasters were giving rise to concerns for their health and emotional well-being. It was felt by some that a tragedy was not far away if something was not altered soon. The software was considered to be poor quality and not intended to run such a huge network. The system is based on ECO, which was originally written for a network of 700, not 15,500. Given the mention of trauma and the concerns for sub-postmasters' health, did this move further up your priority list?
Yes, I think what was actually happening now was that our executive council members in the North East were flagging these issues up to Federation headquarters, and I must say, our General Secretary and I never missed an opportunity with representing these views to the Post Office. But I must say, I always, at those meetings, had a feeling that there was always cost in everything, and obviously making the network viable and everything else, as far as Post Office councils were concerned. And I think they were in the same situation, that they needed to maintain the income stream from the benefits agency more than anything. And therefore, I think there was many hopes or assurances being given to them that ICL Pathway were putting these issues right.
If we could turn to page 27 of that document, please. If we could actually turn back a page to page 26, please. At the bottom of that page, it says discussion at length took place between members as to whether a public campaign should be started about the project. And many felt that action should begin at once, while others felt that they would lose the goodwill of government and the Post Office if an offensive was launched immediately. A militant attitude may also jeopardise the Federation's acceptance as an equal member of the working party. In general, it was felt no plans could be made until after the issue of the government's white paper in early July, and the contract was signed on the 19th of July. Government and POCL proposals for the future would be clearer, thus giving the Federation a better basis for protecting sub-postmasters' interests in every detail. It was generally agreed that POCL ICL must be made aware of the full extent of sub-postmasters' complaints and problems with the system, and insistence pressed that the problems are all addressed and resolved, even if alterations to the system are required. The National President asked the meeting if everyone was happy that the agreed way forward should be decided on the 11th of July and that a public campaign would not, for the moment, be pursued. Do you remember this discussion taking place?
Yes, I do.
What was the strength of feeling that a public campaign should be started?
I think, bearing in mind the Executive Council was considered of about 20 members, there were always those who had differing opinions, but we have or had successfully fought public campaigns in many instances. And I think that minute probably reflects the overall outcome of the discussion, in so much that if we rocked the boat too far, it was very easy for both the Post Office Councils Limited and or government departments not to bring the Federation to the table, and therefore our voice wouldn't be heard. And so I think it was decided, as the minute says, to see what came out of the white paper and keep our powder dry, knowing that we would have the ability, if we wished to start a public campaign at any time.
At this stage, were you telling sub-postmasters not to criticise the system publicly?
No. Not that I can recall. We would never have done that. It was up to sub-postmasters individually to say what they felt, and obviously we, in Federation headquarters, wanted as much feedback to take to the Post Office of anything that wasn't seen to be right about the system.
At the end of this page, the meeting pauses and you go to a meeting of the Working Party. Did you feel, when you went to that Working Party meeting, that you had the words of the sub-postmasters ringing in your ears about the difficulties they were having?
Yes, and if I remember rightly, I think at one of these, if it's not the next Working Party meeting, the General Secretary, Colin Baker, raised some matters concerning all of this.
So if we turn over the page to page 28, and if we look at this paragraph in the middle that says the subject of system faults was raised and the NFSP were given assurances that there would be software improvements to cure the present difficulties. The Federation were asked for more precise numbers of sub-postmasters who were experiencing difficulties, as this information would assist them to provide us with the help we require. This is your report when you come back to the Executive Council meeting. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
And if we can turn to the minutes of that meeting, which is at NFSP 50203. That's NFSP 50203. Yeah. And then if we could turn to page 3. So this is, sorry, if we could turn back a page. This is the note of the meeting of the Working Party that was officially circulated. And if we turn over to page 5. Sorry, not page 5, page 2, paragraph 5, my apologies. It says, paragraph 5, Mr. Baker said that it was extremely important for the rollout to be absolutely right with so many planned per week, 300. There would be risk of collapse otherwise. Is that reflecting the previous note that we looked at, which said that issues were raised about software?
Yes, I think the amongst the many discussions was things like the pace of rollout, the number that the system was capable of handling. Because, of course, with limited knowledge of a new IT system to some postmasters way back all that time ago, I think there was a general conception, or even probably misconception, whichever it may be, that with such a vast network, was this system capable of handling the transactions in such large volumes and numbers that were going over post office counters? And well, I won't go into it now in case you're going to, but I refer in my statement to my witness statement to instances of the system being so slow, and therefore this was all considered to be, in our limited knowledge, the system being incapable of dealing with all those transactions that were coming from all parts of the United Kingdom into some central IT system base.
This minute doesn't reflect that the issues in the previous minute that we looked at about software problems were raised in this working party. Do you recall them being raised?
No, I don't, or that while ago, have any recollection. I do recollect, as I've said earlier, that sometimes I felt we were there to make up a number, or the fact that we had a presence and everybody could say we were there on the attendees had more relevance than some of the other discussions that were wanted to be had in that working group.
Mr. Baker said in his evidence on Wednesday that he didn't feel that the working group was the appropriate place to be raising issues with what was happening on the ground with some sub-postmasters. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I think because our direct conduit, where we thought we got any action, was dealing with post office counters at whatever level we could, whether that be at levels like, has been mentioned, Dave Miller, Stuart Sweetman, or even higher. And if we needed to, and with the opportunities, when we met or could meet, anybody in the DTI, for example. I mean, we had so many meetings with so many managers of Post Office Counters Limited when these issues were raised on numerous occasions. And of course, it was a reliance that those managers were taking that even further. And as much as we pushed and pushed, we didn't always get answers.
If we could move forward slightly to the 7th of July 1999, and we can pull up NFSP 50200. And page 2, please. So this is a further meeting on the 7th of July of the Horizon Working Group. And if we look at paragraph 4, please. It says, on acceptance testing, Mr. Miller said that the work was going ahead with ICL to a pre-agreed programme. Mr. Peberdy asked what defined a high category incident. Mr. Miller said this would be one which threatened progress with the project within the agreed timescale. He did not think there would be major problems. Mr. Hodgson emphasised the need for regular progress reports. So at this time, were you raising things like acceptance testing, and did you feel like you were being listened to by the working group?
I felt that the relevance of that question to try and draw out of particularly Dave Miller and others what they considered something really high, because the various things that have been reported into Post Office Counters Limited, I don't know how high they considered them on their agenda, as far as we considered them extremely high on our own agenda on behalf of Sub Postmasters.
Did you feel that as part of this, you should have been raising the issues that you knew Sub Postmasters were encountering in using the system?
I'm not sure that at that stage and that relevant minute was at the stage it was. Dave Miller was well aware, with meetings we'd had with him directly in Post Office Counters headquarters, of our concerns. I was trying to draw out of him what he considered to be a major high situation risk, and whether it was just something that was jeopardising the whole programme.
If we could look at paragraph 9 of that document, which is over the page. Mr. Baker is recorded as having made a comment. It says in the middle of that paragraph, well, I'll read the whole paragraph. Moving on to a report on the government's intention to establish an interdepartmental working group on POCL funding issues, Mr. McCartney said the current speculation in the press on the future of the network was not a helpful background. Mr. Baker said he thought the group should have a role in disseminating good news stories to counter the scaremongering. Do you know what the scaremongering was at that time?
Yes, my recollection was, of course, that the scaremongering was that the benefits agency were going to move away from post offices, that therefore there would be a collapse of the post office network, and Sub Postmasters would lose the value of their investments. And I presume what Mr. Baker was also saying, that amongst all that, the fact that we were going to have an automated network, hopefully, was something that was going to give another revenue stream to Sub Postmasters by Post Office Counters Limited being able to attract more business. We wanted, for example, banking over post office counters in those days, which didn't exist and needed to have it if the benefits agency were going to, in 2003, move towards automated credit transfer. The post office network was such a vast network, it was there to do so much business, and there was so much business that could be captured, and especially in an automated system, and that's what Mr. Baker was referring to about let's get some of those good news stories out there so we can attract that business, as opposed to trying to frighten those other revenue streams and new business away from the post office.
So it wasn't to do with the Horizon project itself?
It was, to my knowledge, not at that stage what he was saying. The press were talking about what they had picked up that was seemingly going wrong, and obviously individual Sub Postmasters in individual offices were probably being, or might have been giving stories to local newspapers, etc. And some of that, I believe, was being picked up. And we, as I say, on numerous occasions, had banged that gong with the post office.
And did you agree with Mr. Baker that there should be encouraging news circulating in a group set up to counter that narrative?
Yes, I perceived that the Federation's role in this was one to make sure that all Sub Postmasters, as I said a moment ago, were able to attract new business, and the ability, once that network was automated, for many forms of business, including government business, over post office counters, was something that we didn't want to give the impression that we were a dime breed and everybody else needn't start to look to the post office to put their new business over all those post offices right throughout the country, no matter what the business was.
Moving forward to the 10th of August 1999, if we could pull up NFSP 50237, please. These are minutes of a special Horizon meeting that took place in Kingston Park Rugby Club in Newcastle. Dave Miller is mentioned, the POCL Network Director, and Colin Baker, the General Secretary. Do you recall being at this meeting?
Truthfully, I don't. I do, having read some of this in the bundle. I mean, I think the title is slightly misleading. It was a National Federation of Postmasters meeting on a special meeting on the subject of Horizon that was called by the Executive Council members in Newcastle area, and Dave Miller was invited to that meeting.
It says at the top that the meeting was chaired by the national president, Jean Kendall. So can I take it that by then you'd cease to be president?
Yes, I had, Mr. Chairman. I had ceased, and Jean Kendall was a sub-postmistress actually in the North East, and she was an Executive Council member as well as national president in that area.
So you began, Kennedy asked you when you were president. Is this right, that it began in 1998 and ended sometime before the 10th of August 1999?
Yeah, it would be an annual. You're reminding me now, all that time ago. To the earlier question, it was an annual appointment and an annual election.
Thank you.
And if we look further down that page, it says the meeting was then open for sub-postmasters to comment on the Horizon programme and for questions to be asked of POCL and requests made for future actions. And then they're listed. It lists the stress of the workforce, the strain on people's lives and marriages, lost holidays, and then lastly, on the 44 Horizon officers present in a vote, 30 officers said they suffered stress and only 4 thought payment was sufficient. Were you aware of this feedback at this time in August 1999?
I was aware of it when I next spoke to Colin Baker, and we obviously had a discussion about what we were going to try and do with it. But as you probably gather from part of that minute, pay was always a large consideration of sub-postmasters, who always thought they didn't have as much of the cake that the Post Office Counters Limited got as they did themselves. And obviously things that were starting, because we employed our own staff, things that were starting to delay them, as it was said in one of the earlier questions, extra payments to staff. Staff were paid probably hourly rates if they were going to stay later on Friday nights or other nights. That was going to give all those costs to Post Office Limited. Also, obviously, quite a lot of sub-postmasters ran their post offices with their wives or partners, and that's where obviously waiting late, especially if they were having to stay in the post office, weren't tending to their children, all sorts of other various things were putting strain on family life, and on, I think it even put in that minute something, strain on their marriage. So there was a lot of, it was a whole new learning curve for sub-postmasters, which came in with quite a lot of stress.
If we could turn to page 4, please. There were specific issues raised about balancing, and it says every office complained of system failure, every balance day need to reboot. POCL have a system to know how many reboot without officers informing POCL, but no action taken by POCL to improve situation. Waiting time at helpline for rebooting instructions makes SPMs act on their own. I mean, this is a real problem, isn't it? People struggling with balancing.
Yes, it was. I would have said at that stage it was the major problem of the Horizon system.
And at that time, did you think that it was an issue with the system itself, or that sub-postmasters needed to get with the system and adapt?
It's very difficult actually to be precise because of the various transactions and various amounts of stock, for example, that a sub-postmaster is responsible for, and the way that you handle transactions. The system was such that you had to tell the system what you'd got left in, for example, first-class stamps. And if you had sold 10 first-class stamps to somebody and forgotten to take the money as part of a transaction, you were going to get a misbalance. So there were various factors that fed into it, but the major concern definitely was that this was all system driven. Because the system went down and because of the length of time and having to reboot it, obviously we started to question things of, were things missed if the system rebooted? We didn't know. Nobody knew in those days what was going on in the back end of this system. And therefore were misbalances occurring because of the system or because of supposed master fault?
Did you feel like you could have done more to question what was going wrong with the system or whether there were issues with the system?
No, I wouldn't. No, I wouldn't accept that. I think we tried our hardest to query it. I often wondered whether the post office went far enough in dealing with it, in so much as trying to find out what was wrong, more than try and make the pounds, shillings, and pence Barrett, if I can go back that far before decimalisation. Because, in truth, the post office had got nothing to lose. The postmaster paid. So, if my post office was £500 short, I put the £500 in out of my pocket. It didn't cost Post Office Counters Limited a penny.
Moving forward to the 11th of October, a further working group minute. If we could turn up NFSP 6066. And if we could turn to page 4, please. So this is where the meeting minute begins. And then if we turn to page 5, paragraph 5, which is also on page 5. Thank you. And paragraph 5, it says, Mr. Miller explained that formal acceptance of the reconfigured Horizon system planned for 18th of August had been postponed because of POCL's concern about training, system stability, data integrity. There had been an unacceptably high level of screen freezes and the effective operation of the help desk. The Post Office had accepted the system on the 24th of September on the basis that effective remedial action had either been completed or was in hand. Did you understand at the time what was meant by data integrity?
I'm not, as it was all new, I'm not sure I fully understand what data integrity fully meant, but I was well aware of those issues, and therefore that one of the things that always worried me and other sub-postmasters, and things we represented to the post office, the system froze so often, and in a naive way back in 1999 or whenever it was, one always wondered what happened when that system came back. You know, this was a great new project, so something had suddenly, you'd put some transactions into the system froze, you had to wait for the system to reboot. Were those transactions lost? And it was always a point that we represented to the post office, but we never got the true answers, because I'm never sure that the post office went to ICL Pathway and dug deep enough into it. I'm not even sure that ICL Pathway wasn't protecting itself in it as well.
If we look further down that minute at paragraph 7, it says, Mr. Deegan asked about the issues of spare capacity and triggers for payment. Mr. Miller confirmed that the post office were clear that they would be able to use spare capacity on the system. This had previously been an issue of dispute with ICL. The post office will pay ICL 60 million on the 24th of October on initial acceptance of the system, and will pay ICL a further 80 million when they achieve rollout to 1,600 offices, which is planned for around Christmas time. ICL would not receive payment until the target had been reached, though the post office was not expecting significant slippage. Mr. Baker expressed support for the post office's position. Whilst there was a need for ICL to hit deadlines, it was also important for the system to be delivered in full working order. The feedback which Mr. Baker had received from NFSP members was intermittent and not all positive, but problems now seemed to be being sorted and training seemed to have improved. That statement by Mr. Baker that not all feedback was positive, is that a fair reflection? From what I've taken you to, it seems like it was fairly negative.
Yes.
So would you say that it would have been better to say the feedback has been negative? Well,
I can't quite speak for Mr. Baker and his words, but I'm not sure that negative would be the correct word, but it was, we were receiving assurances in meetings with the post office that a lot had gone behind the scenes to put it right. And I think that minute and what Dave Miller said reflective of where they saw they were. And obviously the previous bit about capacity was of great importance to us, because that capacity to put other business onto the Horizon platform was extremely important to us.
Moving forward to February 2000 and later issues, if we could pull up NFSP 50348. This is a letter from Don Gray to Mr. Baker in February 2000. It's not to you, but I believe you also worked with Mr. Gray.
Yes.
What was your experience of working with him like?
I think it was always, Don Gray was always a amenable sort of person. He came from the northeast. I wouldn't say he was particularly dynamic, but he seemed to take on board those issues that we represented to him.
When you say he seemed to take on board, what do you mean by that?
Well, it depends on which of the issues we were talking to him about. I found Don Gray, as you probably said, to be a person that said he was happy to say yes and hopefully get on with it than get into any confrontational issues about things. And we were very reliant on him at those stages, taking back our views and dealing with them.
If we could turn to page 2, please. And if we could look at B. It says, I will pursue the issues around John Peberdy's training when you let me have details. Do you know what that relates to?
Yes, obviously a large part of the rollout of Horizon was the training. And the training was far from where it should have been for all postmasters at various levels of knowledge of anything to do with IT. And I had issues that had been represented to me on training being poor, not enough training officers, not taking over the right times, being too brief, and therefore those sub-postmasters just feeling that the training had been insufficient for them to fully operate the system, and it was a very big concern.
Moving forward again to the 10th of February 2000, if we could turn up NFSP 50261. This is a circulation to the National Executive Council from Mr. Baker, which says having put pressure on the Automation Director for some information regarding the Horizon rollout, I'm sure you'll be keen to see a letter which we've received which sets out the position following the review held by the Post Office. Hopefully a regular dialogue will soon be established at territorial level in order to assist members to overcome the difficulties they may well experience as their offices are automated. And if we turn to page 2, we've got a letter to Mr. Baker from David Smith. And if we could pull out the last paragraph, which is to do with the feedback points. So this is following a review by the Post Office and a study, and it says the feedback points in the direction of training, balancing and help desks as the major improvement areas, with balancing very much the common theme. However, in each of these areas, outlets are more or less evenly split between those who think we've got it right as opposed to wrong. The trick to be pulled off is to improve matters for those who believe we need to improve without turning off those that we think have got it right. At this stage, in your mind, was training the key issue of those things?
Yes.
Not balancing, or did you think the two were related?
Yeah, the two were obviously hand in glove, because the training apart from relating to day-to-day transactions, the training obviously also covered the once weekly balancing. And in fairness, without that denigrating anybody, I suppose the varying degrees of intelligence or acceptance of IT by various postmasters, because we'd have some who were elderly and others who were younger, and embracing it differently led to that statement. But there were very many training issues out there, insufficient trainers knowledge, and of course at one time the rollout was going at such a tremendous rate that I left many sub-postmasters needing further training, needing further help our very much insistence that they had a very good help desk. But then when that came, there were queues to get to the help desk, but that's probably something you want to cover later on.
If we could move forward to the 4th of May 2000, a National Executive Council circular, it's NFSP 6020. This circular to the executive officers deals with balancing problems to do with Horizon. And the first paragraph says, you may no doubt be aware that there were significant difficulties with Horizon balancing at some post offices yesterday. We are waiting for a definitive answer from POCL on the problems encountered. However, what we know so far is that a problem arose last Thursday morning on the uprating of stamps, and resulting from poor advice, some sub-postmasters did not correctly complete the upgrading of stock reconciliation that day. That manifested when they tried to balance yesterday. And if we could turn over the page, it says, the difficulties with Horizon yesterday, we were advised, was primarily not a systems fault. It was primarily difficulties encountered by sub-postmasters last Thursday in understanding the instructions for uprating their postage stock, which led to balancing difficulties yesterday, 3rd of May. They have accepted there is a clear learning point to make sure instructions are more understandable, and they have also accepted a need to review and communicate the difficulties of what they've learned both to those within the business and to sub-postmasters. They are, however, trying to deal with the problems today, and clearly this is the most critical aim for them to focus on. Did the Post Office tend to chalk issues with balancing up to training, as opposed to a systems fault?
Could you repeat that? Sorry. Did the Post Office
tend to chalk issues with balancing up to training as opposed to a systems fault?
No, I think what was totally wrong here was my recollection of this happened, and it was horrendous across the network because postage stamps had gone up. And therefore, if you had got in your stock, to be very simplistic, a first-class postage stamp that was 20 pence, and it had gone up back in those days to 22 pence, there was a system or an instruction that told us, all the sub-postmasters, how to upgrade those stamps for that extra 2p, because of course once you were otherwise, if you put them in at 22 pence, you were going to make a profit, or you would have an overage as opposed to anything else. And so there was an unclear instruction, or it wasn't clear enough for all sub-postmasters to deal with, or some might not have dealt with them. Hence that problem that was a major, major problem on, I believe it was the 3rd of May, as you've already said.
Did you feel it was difficult to ascertain whether something was a systems problem or an instruction problem?
Correct. I wouldn't know.
If we could turn to NFSP 50153. This is from November 2000, and it's a circular from a Kevin Davis. This relates to gyro daily reports. It says, I've recently received a number of reports about ghost entries on gyro daily reports. I have been in continual discussion with PONU, firstly to identify the exact problem, which officers were affected and how it can be rectified. I'm advised it only affects CSR plus officers and only where a shared stock unit is used. The problem will be fixed by means of a software drop in December. In the meantime, a message broadcast should have been made to all CSR plus officers today. Attached is a copy of the draft message for your information. The text in italic at the beginning of the message will not be included in the broadcast. And if we could turn over to the next page. And if we could look at the main paragraph, I think 4 paragraphs down, which starts with, there have been occasions where gyroback transactions entered onto CSR plus Horizon terminals may not be visible on the office copy and the Horizon daily records. The transaction will, however, be included in the grand total value and value reported to the cash account. In addition, the individual totals on one or more Horizon daily records may be wrong. This fault is due to be fixed in December. Do you remember this particular issue?
Not clearly, but by reading that earlier, it did refresh my mind of what was actually happening, yes.
And at this time, when this issue arose, did you think, all these sub-postmasters have been saying they're having issues with balancing, maybe there's something wrong with the system, given the system isn't infallible?
If I can relate that back to my own office, what actually happened was in those transactions we're going through, in a normal office, you would get a printout, you're going to send those documents off in the evening, and you would check that those documents were there against what had been printed out. Therefore, there were those missing. This was obviously going to lead to you either wondering if you'd put it through, and there would be instances where those transactions had therefore been put in again, and all sorts of things. So it was, as we said, a concern which was rapidly flagged up, but again, nobody knew what was going on in the back office system, and one had to go with the assurances that were being given to us on behalf of sub-postmasters.
Moving next to January 2001, a report of a meeting of the National Executive Council. If we could turn up NFSP 50557. And if we could turn to page 9, please. We can see that you're again addressing the council on the issue of counter-automation. And you say that you thought that Don Gray did his best to sort out the problems with Horizon. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Yeah. Is that your view?
Yes, it was, because Don Gray was the person we represented problems to, and it seemed that he, from what he fed back to us, was doing his best to make sure that what we had gone to him with, he was doing his best to resolve.
If we could turn to page 10, please. In the bottom half of the page, it refers to Horizon polling problems. It says Mr. Peberdy reported that it was essential that sub-postmasters knew of these types of problems. They needed to know a bit more. They were awaiting responses to what had gone wrong and why they'd been kept in the dark. Do you remember this and what Horizon polling problems refers to?
Truthfully, not fully, but it was, I perceived at the time it was a system glitch, and that we were, as it said when I was reporting it, that we weren't fully appraised of what it was, and we felt that we were, as that says, being kept in the dark.
Do you feel like you took adequate steps to rectify this problem?
Yeah, I think we always, as I keep saying, we always represented them to Post Office Limited. We had to take their answers that they were dealing with them, and you would be forever pushing Post Office Limited to find out the individual answers, and they were obviously working with ICL Pathway or whomever they were dealing with to try and resolve each of these issues.
And lastly, could we go to March 2001? The document is NFSP 50513. Thank you. You can see there that it's a report of the National Executive Council meeting. And if we could turn to page 15. And again, picking up the Horizon polling problems, which I think you mentioned a moment ago you thought were a systems glitch. Mr. Peberdy reported that these problems are still being highlighted and just recently had been circulated and reported on the problems in organising meetings with the business, but now monthly meetings have been scheduled. And there was a meeting on the 26th of February 2001, which could be seen from the action points. There were 28 items that required action. Some of them the business still had to come back to them on. Did you find it frustrating dealing with POCL with these kinds of issues?
Yeah, very much so. It was such a major part of what Colin Baker had to spend his time on, and I did. And as I said earlier, it always, in the back of my mind, worried me that if it was something that was going wrong, the post office weren't having to foot the bill, because if this resulted in error, it was the sub-postmaster who was left putting his hand in his pocket.
Yes, and looking at the next paragraph, it says, amongst it, one was set up the two-day meeting, a separate meeting on losses and gains policy, a separate group to bring in the Horizon problems. There have been stories about problems that have been created by Horizon, shortages. Horizon was not doing things, the problem with losses having to be made good immediately, and all the things about suspense accounts. He reported that he wanted a group to examine this. He had been led to understand there was 10 million in suspense accounts now, as opposed to 2 million 8 months ago. Another feature of the system was that it highlighted everything. Were you concerned about the amount in the suspense accounts?
Yes.
Why?
Well, obviously, as that actually says, there was such a massive increase. At that time, if the sub-postmaster had a shortage or a gain, he could ask for it to be put into a suspense account, and the Horizon system had an ability to do that. Obviously, these amounts had therefore escalated to the level that we were talking about there. Hence, we wanted, that being the Federation, a meeting with the Post Office to establish a new losses and gains policy, because, of course, they were rapidly now trying to get sub-postmaster to make these good, stop them being in the suspense account for so long, and obviously they wanted to reduce the amount of money that they saw as owed to them, and we were concerned that those sub-postmasters didn't sufficiently know enough about how those shortages came about to just ask them to immediately pay it. And as I've said more than once, this was post office counters having their money back and sub-postmasters having to pay. I have many reports from sub-postmasters to me that they either couldn't afford to repay these amounts, didn't know how they became short, and were obviously very worried about it. There were offices that had a very good balancing record while they were doing manual transactions, and now were having losses which they had not previously experienced until they had an automated system. So it couldn't all been down to somebody failing to put a transaction through, somebody failing to keep a document that they needed for their balancing. So there must have been more behind it.
Chair, I don't have any further questions.
Just so that I'm not getting things wrong, if that document could be put up again, please, on the page you were last at. You see the reference, Mr. Peberdy, to £10 million at that point, March 2001, and £2 million 18 months previously. Yeah. Well, we will see it when it comes back.
Yeah, 513.
Anyway, I think this is right, but please correct me if I'm wrong. Effectively, over the period of the rollout, as it started late 99, yeah, this figure had jumped from 2 million to 10 million. Is that it?
Correct.
Yeah. And do I take it that even in the paper days, there was some money in the suspense account?
Yes.
From your just general recollection, in the paper days, had it ever reached anything like £10 million?
From what I can remember, no. And, they were smaller amounts, and this was a massive escalation. Hence, I felt it necessary to report it at that stage to the Executive Council.
Sure, thank you. Yeah. I just wanted to be sure I got it correct. Anybody else? Any questions?
So yes, briefly.
Yeah.
Mr. Peberdy, can we stay with the document you've just been asked questions about, which is NFSP 500513? If we can have that on the screen, and this time, please, can we go to page 16? That's relativity, page number 16. Internal pagination of the document, pages 14 and 15. I'm going to take you to a particular part, which is reference to Mr. Cyril Jones, which is the third paragraph on that page. If you could, thank you very much. Now, I'll ask you about the terms used in a minute, but this sets out that Mr. Cyril Jones said that there had been a meeting with a horn, and this problem had been brought up. He'd been very concerned about this problem causing problems in the appeals area and forcing unnecessary appeals. Security went in at some point and made a recommendation that the sub-postmaster was responsible for the entire loss. That was then sent off to the RNM because the final decision as to whether to ask for that amount. In most cases, the RNM took the report as verbatim, which was causing a lot of problems. So let's just explain a couple of those terms. First of all, Horn, H-O-R-N.
Head of Retail Network, from my recollection.
Thank you. Now, security went in at some point. Who are you referring to there? Who is Mr. Jones referring to there?
I presume in that he's probably talking about the audit team.
Thank you. And then lastly, RNM.
Retail Network Manager.
Okay. So thank you for the assistance in explaining the terms. Does this particular paragraph and point being raised by Mr. Jones tell us that what was going on was that all too often the assumption was made that the sub-postmaster was responsible for the entire loss?
Correct.
And that the RNM, with your explanation, took the report, presumably report of losses, as verbatim, which was causing a lot of problems.
Yes.
Okay.
I think if you want a little bit more explanation, I mean, these were the cases that, I mean, I presume you've had and know how these things come about when an audit team turns up at an office and the office becomes short. A lot of sub-postmasters were very fearful of this and fearful that if the office was short, they might lose their office, or, as subsequently happened, and we all know now with hindsight, many were prosecuted.
Yes, and I think then if we can go to a part of this that has your reference, I believe it's over the next page. Yes, the fourth paragraph down, starting with Miss Peberdy. If we can highlight that, please. Put it enlarge it on the screen, then highlight, please. Yes. Mr. Peberdy said that they had just sent a very strong signal to Mike Granville that because of the financial plight of the business, they were playing a lot harder ball over losses and sticking everything they could onto the sub-postmaster. There was pressure on the business, end of the financial year. Now again, let's unwrap that. Mike Granville?
One of the senior post office managers at the time.
Thank you. And the reference here to the financial plight of the business, which business are you referring to?
Post Office Counters Limited.
Okay. So Mr. Peberdy said that sent a very strong signal to Mike Granville because of the financial plight of the business, which is the post office, that they were playing a lot harder ball over losses. What did you mean by, therefore, sticking everything they could onto the sub-postmaster?
Right. In that particular reference, we're still sort of probably talking about losses. And this amount that was sitting in the suspense accounts, that Post Office Counters Limited obviously perceived was due to them from the sub-postmaster, and their financial year end and the state of post office accounts with a large amount sticking in suspense accounts wasn't, in my view, looking good for them, and therefore they wanted to get this money in and were taking a lot harder line. We did have situations where the post office, on representations probably from Federation representatives, would agree to some of these losses, which postmasters in many cases just had to accept, and they didn't know whether they were right or wrong, could be spread over a period of time. And we did have an agreement with them that, I can't remember the length of period, that losses could be kept in the suspense account for a period of time. The reason behind that was for them, the business hopefully, to examine and see if documentation came forward or anything else came forward that proved that loss. I'll give you a very simplistic example that might have been the sub-postmaster's fault, that a sub-postmaster amongst a multiple transaction hadn't charged the customer for something, like, I don't know, book of stamps. That customer might have come back next week and said, by the way, you didn't charge me for these last week. Simplistically, it's a small amount, but hence a suspense account was there for those reasons. But at that time, at this stage, that this minute's recording is that the Post Office were definitely taking a stronger view as to getting that money back into their coffers and the sub-postmasters having to pay.
And you allied that to the fact that the business, which is the Post Office, was having financial difficulties.
Well, I'm not quite sure I was quite saying. I was saying there was pressure on their business. Nobody likes a business that's losing masses of money, especially if it's partly owned by the government. And so, therefore, they would be keen, as a lot of businesses probably would, not to have a big suspense account sitting on their balance sheet.
And such was your view, was that you put it this way, sticking everything that they could onto the sub-postmaster. Mr Peberdy, we do have some further questions, but they're for a later stage in the inquiry. We've been assured that you and indeed Mr Baker will be returning to the witness stand or table at a later point in the inquiry.
I'm very happy to do so.
Thank you.
Yep, please.
So I won't be that long. Mr Peberdy, I'd just like to ask you about two more documents, if I may, please.
Certainly.
The first is reference NFSP 50540. And we can see from the front page here that this is the minutes of the National Executive Council meeting held on the 4th and 5th of June of 2001. And if we went to the next page, we'd be able to see that you were present at this meeting. Thank you. And could we please go to page 14 of this document? Because as you said, as it's coming up, the question of the continuing question of the reliability, so it's 14 of the document, that's my fault. Yeah. The continuing question of the reliability of Horizon and counter-automation was effectively a standing item so far as Executive Council meetings were concerned around this time. Could I ask that the paragraph 6 there is, thank you, and Mrs Reeves reported that at the beginning of the automation of Horizon, an office was allowed to work manually, input later, and that talks about the system going down and the chairman saying that he didn't know the answer. Mrs Jenkins stated that the problems experienced with Horizon were raised at conference, and it may be that we've seen the minutes of that conference already. It was promised on the platform that there would be a national forum to look at the problem. Were we anywhere nearer to getting this set up, and how was it going to work? And then if we could go over the page, please. To page 15. Yes. The chairman said that they should have a user group, a national forum, to deal with Horizon errors and problems with the system. It was an action point that from 26th of February. May I ask you, Mr Peberdy, was there ever a meeting of, firstly, was there ever a meeting of a national forum in that way?
Not that I can recall, no. Unless we're actually, I'm not sure whether this was prior to the Horizon Working Group or after the Horizon Working Group.
But this is June 2001.
And the Horizon Working Group would have been in place by then.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, just in terms of what that national forum might have looked like, would it have been an invitation to all sub-postmasters to come along and express their experiences, relate their experiences as to the problems that they might be experiencing with Horizon?
I'm not quite sure what the chairman directly was meaning about it by a user group, but the sort of thing that we would, as a federation, have tried to do in those sort of instances was either have had a special conference when we would have called delegates, because we couldn't invite everybody there. If I can just sort of take you back, the federation was structured in such a way that we had executive officers in the regions of the country, branch secretaries beneath those executive officers in the individual branches, and obviously sub-postmasters went to meetings. I do have to also flag up, of course, unfortunately, not all sub-postmasters were members of the Federation, and there were some who didn't want to upset the post office, so we didn't always get the full feedback from them. But that would have alluded to, we wanted to find some means, and I got a feeling that subsequently to that, at the next Executive Council meeting, part of it, we asked those executive officers to bring any instances that they got, or to send them into Shoreham so that we could represent them directly to the post office.
Right.
Sorry, I can't be more explicit than that.
No, but it may assist your memory to, as you suggest, move to the minutes of the next meeting, which are at NFSP 50501. And this is the minutes of the National Executive for July of 2001.
Yep.
And if we could please go to its internal page 18 of this document. Thank you. And if we could highlight the section at the bottom under Horizon. We see that the chairman reported that the negotiating committee had visited Dearne Valley. It had been agreed that a subcommittee would be formed to resolve some of the major Horizon issues. Don Gray had suggested meeting once every 4 months in either Dearne Valley or London. Attendees from Post, if you could please go over the page, Post Office Network were to be Don Gray, Mark Haynes, Julian White and Liz Tuddenham, and from the NFSP, Colin Baker, John Peberdy and Jean Kendall. The initial meeting is scheduled for October. They were continuing to progress the eye test issue, which was in the action points under the overview of meetings. Do you remember whether or not there were meetings of that Horizon subcommittee?
Yeah, I think that drawing my attention back to it. I believe that Dearne Valley was the Horizon help desk, and yes, we did have meetings there because we were anxious to see what was coming into the help desk, what sort of questions were coming in, and how they were dealing with them, and how they were helping sub-postmasters to resolve those issues.
So if we could just go on to the next paragraph, please, within this document, to see what Mrs. Bethel says. Mrs. Bethel said that she had 3 items to raise under this section. The first was a request for a progress report on barcoded hand pouches, as a number of pouches were still going missing. Mr. Davis, replied that he'd not been advised when barcoding of pouches was to start, but he would endeavour to find out. And the next paragraph, please. The second was about the benefits agency linked to Horizon. Mrs. Bethel was receiving a number of complaints from sub-postmasters who were having letters from the benefits agency accusing them of paying out on books which had been impounded. Sub-postmasters had acted on the instructions on the system, and the benefits agency did not believe them. It was going on sub-postmasters' files that they were paying on impounded books, although it had been agreed back in week 5 of 2000 that there was a problem with the system. This information would remain on sub-postmasters' files despite requests that it be removed. It had been suggested that there should be a printout when a book was impounded. It could then be proved that the sub-postmaster had done as the system instructed. Did you ever become aware of sub-postmasters being prosecuted for what might be described as a reintroduction fraud of introducing Gyro's benefit slips into the system when a book had been impounded?
I wasn't aware of them being prosecuted for it. The system did ask the postmaster to impound a book when the barcode was read, if that book had been withdrawn for some reasons. I was not aware. I can see what Mrs. Bethel said, who was in Liverpool and a representative of the North West, that she represented an area of very, as she told us at the Executive Council's meetings, of very high numbers of gyros being encashed at some post offices. Hence her desire for the barcode pouches, by the way. And that there obviously were instances in the North West where the books had been stopped by the benefits agency and probably a gyro paid because of people couldn't manage or all sorts of various reasons. But I wasn't aware that then some postmasters were fraudulently paying those benefits.
Thank you very much, Mr. Peberdy. That's all I ask.
Thank you. That it?
Chair, I think that's it.
Thank you very much for your witness statement and for coming to give oral evidence.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been my pleasure. I
And,
hope I can help the inquiry in the future.
Thank you. So I think that completes what I'll call the schedule of witnesses to date on phase 2. I say to date because you never know, do you? So that leaves 2 oral submissions this afternoon, is that correct? Yes. And I lay down the guidelines, and I take it you're both happy to be within those guidelines?
Yes.
Thank you. See you at 2:15? It's now nearly 15:15.
So yes,
From my part, and I spoke to another friend about this, I think I'll be about half an hour, so we're within the guidelines. Is there a stopping time today, though? We were told that you may wish to stop at 3 o'clock.
Well, there's no official stopping time in the sense we have to finish at 3 o'clock. The difficulty is that I want to have a meeting with my team who are considering how to handle next Thursday in the lunch break rather than after we finish this afternoon. But I'm quite happy to try and do that by 2 o'clock.
So, yeah.
And then if you were half an hour and if Mr. Maloney is much the same, we won't be far off 3 o'clock.
So if you find that it's too much of a rush to finish by 2, then I think I can abridge my submissions without doing any injustice to them.
Don't worry. Let's say 2 o'clock, and I will, I'm sure, be briefed sufficiently about Thursday by then. And we'll hear you between 2 and 3, he says, optimistically.
So, yes, thank you.